So, Sandra, let's talk about your conference, the international trends of assessment center, because everybody in Russia would like to know what's the news, the hot news about that. We are very innovative nation, you know, we always seek for some changes. That's why we'd like to hear about new trends from the first high-class experts like you.
Thanks for inviting me to this interview. You've asked me to talk about my passion in life, and my passion is assessment centers and specifically simulations. You've asked about the trends, the new trends in assessment centers. Well, we all know that COVID had a major impact. So what COVID did to assessment centers, it accelerated trends that have started to emerge over the last 2-3 years. So we see a big trend towards using artificial intelligence to help with the compilation of the scores, what we call the algorithms behind the scenes. We also see that more and more companies are starting to use artificial intelligence and machine learning to assist with the physical scoring of simulations as well, both the written content, but also translating the words into written format. Then there are also companies that started to use avatars as role players. So instead of using real humans, the participants interact with an avatar. And then also related to technology, there are companies, and I'm specifically thinking about Anna from Poland, who is at the university, and I apologize, I cannot pronounce the university's name that she's at. She's working on assessment centers using augmented reality. So the participants use those cameras that they put over their heads, and then they participate in simulations. What we've also seen during the past 12 months is a massive movement to take in-person assessment centers online. So there are various ways in which companies have done that. Some, the more progressive companies, they've used a platform that makes it possible to have a seamless integration of the simulations. But other companies have used Zoom technology, Word documents that you can upload to the cloud. So they've used what we call sticky tape to make the assessment center virtual. But in all honesty, given all the technology and the need that COVID brought forward in terms of moving assessment centers online, we are really just scratching the surface of what is possible by using technology. Really to harness the full capability or possibility that technology offers will still take a few years, because it's a question of trial and error and research. And I'm talking about things like new concepts that we can measure, new ways of interpreting information, data that we already have. So we are just at the beginning of all this new developments that will inevitably happen. So what is more interesting is the other aspects, the trends in the other aspects. And here I want to touch about what is being measured. So when we look at leadership behavior, we still see that your traditional competencies and dimensions are still important, but the focus and the weighting have shifted, have changed. As an example, your cognitive competencies are more important than in the past. But added to that are the competencies that relates to the human interaction, working with your subordinates via the internet, you must still connect with them on a very personal level, and you must help them with the stress tolerance. And then, of course, there's our friend resilience. That's more important than ever before, and adaptability, which are related concepts, but which are it's required that those competencies or dimensions be added to your more traditional leadership competencies. So that was a long answer to a short question.
Yeah, but it was very deep question. Sandra, from my perspective, we see some kind of renaissance of assessment centers right now. For example, about 5 years ago, we all observed trend to psychometric tools because they are shorter, they could be implemented online, and what much more important, they are much cheaper comparing with the assessment center. Unfortunately, psychometric tools don't give us real evidences. But a lot of companies are ready to accept this limitation. But now I see that interest to assessment centers and development centers increased. So what do you see from your country, from other countries that you connected with?
I don't think it's a question of psychometrics versus assessment centers. Although in the market we see the pendulum switching between the two poles. And internationally, over the past few years, there was a movement to only using psychometrics. However, the companies realized that although psychometrics are cheaper and quicker to administer, you do not get the same answers to the questions that you want answered during a selection process. So we see that a lot of countries are moving back to using a combination of psychometrics as well as assessment centers. If you look back at the original start of assessment centers in the business environment, the assessment centers that AT&T ran those many years ago, that was exactly what they've done. They've combined psychometrics with simulations in a process to answer their questions. So we do see a resurgence of assessment centers internationally, but then it's a resurgence of assessment centers, of virtual assessment centers. Other words, assessment centers delivered via the internet.
As far as I understood, you will see and hear the presentation about it on your conference.
Definitely. There's quite a few presentations around moving assessment centers online. There are, well, the Martin Lanick presentation, where they've used simulations on one platform to move the in-person to the virtual simulation or assessment center. And there is a group discussion between four companies that did not use a unified platform. They used the sticky tape approach to creating a virtual assessment center. So they will share with the audience what they've learned through that process. What are the advantages and the disadvantages?
Talking about the artificial intelligence and other things, as far as I noticed, because we also designed our own platform for assessment centers with all these difficult things like analytics inside it that usually clients and candidates don't see, but these are one of most important part of such platform and most difficult platform. And what we observed during our experience that in those process, the same as in traditional assessment center, the real traditional assessment center, the education of assessors, their training, their expertise is much more important. What would you say about that?
Well, Definitely, whether it is an in-person traditional assessment center or a virtual assessment center or a technology enhanced assessment center, the skill level or the competence level of your assessors is the critical part, is a make or break. And I explain it usually to people in such a way as to tell them that assessors actually form part of the simulation of the assessment center, not like in psychometrics, where the person administering the test is outside the test itself. Here, the assessor is part of the test. So in terms of moving centers online, you still need the basic assessor skills, but on top of that, you do need to train the assessors on the platform that's being used. And I can add something that I've noticed and from own experience from starting to work online is when you first work with assessors, with virtual assessment centers, you really need to calm them in terms of what happens if things goes wrong. You really have to work on their stress levels so that they are calm enough to actually focus on the work that they need to do. And that sort of process of moving the assessor from in-person to a virtual center also takes some time, because it's not only a cognitive change that they have to make, it's also an emotional change that they have to make.
When we talk about assessment center, sometimes we mix two different terms like assessment center and assessment development center. From my point of view in Russia, I'm at very different understanding of these terms. And sometimes people mix them. From your point of view, what's the right answer? How assessment center, the real assessment center, divided from developmental center?
View it as a continuum. On the one side, you've got assessment centers for selection, and on the other side, you've got development assessment centers. Don't be confused. The term assessment center is the generic term, and sometimes it's generically used for development assessment centers as well as assessment centers for selection purposes. But when looking at the difference, let's start with an assessment center for selection purposes. That is the most popularly used type of assessment center. Assessment center for selection purposes, a participant, as an example, would do the one simulation after the other and might or might not get feedback as to how they've performed during those simulations. And the assessors don't really interact with the participants. They just fulfill the role of being an assessor. Now, somewhere halfway between assessment center for selection and the development assessment center, you come across what is called a diagnostic assessment center. Now, a diagnostic center follows the same process as an assessment center, but with the difference that participants do get feedback and they do get a development plan. And then we come to a development assessment center. And the difference lies in, first and foremost, the process that's being followed. At the development assessment center, the participant would participate in a simulation, would get feedback and coaching about the simulation they've just attended, and then they have the opportunity to redo the simulation again. So you can hear that a development assessment center would take much longer than an assessment center for selection purposes because of this continuous feedback and continuous redoing simulations. Then Svetlana, another big difference between the two is that everything that you work with at a development assessment center must be developable.
This is key point, Sandra, because I hear questions from my clients very commonly. what competencies are developed and what are not. Could you share your opinion?
So competencies where you can clearly see activities. You can clearly see a person can do this, 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 and that to achieve the competency. Those types of competencies are developable, like management control. A competency where it becomes difficult to see how it's being developed is a competency like initiative. I do use initiative as a competency in my development assessment centers, but I formulate the definition of that competency in such a way that you can see how to develop it.
Could you give us an example? What kind of indicator we can see and what kind of indicator we can't see that you deleted from the assessment center or development center?
So not knowing the exact definition of results orientation that you refer to, I would say something like ability to achieve or achieving results within a specific time frame. That is something you can see, and you can help a person to develop that approach to deliver within a specific time frame. But if you start looking at some of the negative indicators, like being flustered during a simulation, you can see that, but that is perhaps more difficult to help a person develop not being flustered during a simulation than it is to achieve results within the simulation.
Sandra, could you give us a story about your real project? Because I know that you do a lot of developmental centers, and I remember one of your presentations about the learning center. Just to give us the picture how it's going and what exactly is in this project.
Okay, so I will focus in on what happens at the center. But with the development center, you need to position it within the broader organization, within a broader process. So, for instance, and I'm referring to a development assessment center called a coaching development assessment center that we ran at one of our airlines. So, at the center itself, we start with an in-depth orientation session for the participants so that they know exactly what are the competencies, what are the behavioral anchors in the competencies, what are the simulations, and where what is being measured. Because remember, a principle of a development assessment center is complete transparency. Then the participants would physically do a simulation. Let's say they do an in-basket or in-box. After everyone finished their in-basket, we have what we call a debrief session, which is a group discussion between all the participants, facilitated by a trained or competent facilitator. And there we deal a lot with emotions. So participants would say, oh, this was terrible, it was horrible, and it's unrealistic. And we deal with all those emotions, but participants also learn from each other how the other participants approached the simulation. This debrief also gives the assessor coaches opportunity to work through, let's say, the in-basket and have an idea what's going on in the participants' in-baskets. Then each participant would sit down with their assessor coach, and the two of them would again work through the participants' in-basket, and the participant would sort of self-discover, ooh, I've made this mistake, or that's what I can learn, or this is how I can do it differently. So it's a question of self-learning guided by the coach, and then real coaching taking place during that one-on-one session. And then the participant repeats or does a similar simulation, tapping in on the same competencies that was measured. So it's then the cycle of doing a simulation, debrief, coaching, doing a simulation, debrief, coaching taking place. So basically what we do is we combine the principles of assessment centers with the principles of adult learning during a development assessment center. And then afterwards, we involve the line manager and the person implements his development plan. So that's the micro process.
How much time does it take for the standard developmental or learning center?
That's very difficult to answer because it depends on the competencies that you measure and it depends on the simulations. I always recommend that at least between 2 and 3 simulations in a process like that. So we're talking about averaging 2 to 3 days of the process.
Sandra, let's come back to the conference, which is going to be next week. I know this is the 41st conference already. Could you tell about a little bit about the history of those conferences? Because I wrote to all my clients and I posted on my feedback page that from my point of view, your conference is one of the most interesting from the content point of view, from the networking in the world that I have ever visited. So tell us a little bit about how can you organize it and what do you do to support this high level of content?
So 41, probably 42 years ago, a person by the name of Herman Spannenberg and a group of other people started to work with assessment centers, inspired by the research that's been done at the AT&T in the USA. And they had the need to start a study group that can share research and ideas with each other around assessment centers. So over the years, this grew and it stood the test of time. So we do different things, but mostly we have an annual conference where we get presenters from not only South Africa, but around the world to come and share their research and their practice with us. What assures the quality of the presentations is the fact that we use a blind peer review process. So even if we've asked someone to come and present something at the conference, they must submit an abstract that is sent without their names, it's anonymous, to at least 3 of the panelists of the blind peer review committee. And then based on the feedback from these 3 independent reviewers, we give feedback to the presenters themselves and we choose the best abstracts from what we've received. The people that are on the committee, the blind peer review committee, are people with great standing in the AC fraternity. People like George Thornton, Philippe Lieffens, Martin Kleinman. And then we also have people from industry who works physically with assessment centers in practice, like George Coetzee and Eugene de Bruin. So we combine research or academia with practitioners to give us feedback and inputs in terms of the abstracts.
Sandra, I just advertised a bit your conference, and I wanted to return my question to you because you reviewed all the presentations, all the abstracts. From your point of view, what are most interesting presentation you would advise us to hear?
That's a difficult question. Personally, I'm looking forward, apart from the plenary sessions, because I do think all 4 plenary sessions are must attends. I'm really looking forward to Henny Crick and Kim Doudswell's session on artificial intelligence and the implications for assessment centers. Their presentation will not only be, some research that's done through articles, but they've actually done empirical research in terms of running a mini research study in terms of what can artificial intelligence really do. Then there's also the presentation by Carl Herman and Landi Mashuluhane about designing an entrepreneurial assessment center. But that one is a bit, the trick in that is their population, their target population are teenagers, averaging age between 18 and 20. So they are students, they are scholars without any work experience. So I'm looking forward to the approach they followed in designing a very special assessment center for their circumstance. And then obviously, Svetlana, I'm looking forward to your presentation about the psychological portrait of an entrepreneur, because I do think entrepreneurship is so important for the world right now.
It would be very interesting to compare then the portrait Russian entrepreneur and the entrepreneurial features in other countries, because I believe that cultural impact also exists in this sphere. Let's come back to questions of our audience, because we have some in our list. Sandra, there are a few questions about what competences can be measured, what not, what can be developed, what not, especially about analytical skills and analytical thinking, system thinking. I would add strategic thinking, all those analytical abilities. So what can you say?
So analytical abilities or competencies are the most difficult to develop, and they will take longer to develop. So what I would recommend is that when you have done your job analysis and you've identified the dimensions or the competencies, that you actually look at how you define it. And some of those definitions, like the more cognitive competencies, like strategic thinking, like analytical ability, break them down into how would that behavior look like visibly, and then see if you can break it into steps, to show that behavior. A person needs to do this, 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 and that. And then you also have to consider duration. How long will it take for a person to develop something like that? Now, all your cognitive dimensions take longer to develop, much longer than something like management control, which is probably the easiest competency to develop. So the trick is to break it up into steps of action, visible. It must be visible. So that's what I do, is I literally take a concept and I look at the concept and see, how would we know what would be the visible behaviors that would make us see that the person can do that, and then work from there. So it is Deborah Rupp would tell you that it's not as easy as just saying to do it. You must actually physically sit and apply your mind and see how it can be done. An example, analytical ability. I usually break it down into smaller competencies. For instance, information gathering, judgment, strategic decision making. And each of those competencies I then break into the behavioral anchors. For instance, information gathering would be something like ability to ask questions as an anchor. So I do it in that format.
Thanks, Sandra. We know that analytical skills, strategic thinking, etc., all those analytical block of competencies, strongly related to people's ability, cognitive abilities, that we measure by abilities tests, cognitive reasoning. If person gets low score, lower than average score on ability test, what would be your prognosis to develop his or her analytical skills?
So I would also then look at a person's personality preferences and personality scores, because sometimes a person, even if they score low on cognitive ability, and they have certain personality characteristics, they can perform at a higher level than what their cognitive ability indicates. But that goes with effort, and it is specific long-term developmental focus that's required. But if a person scores cognitively low, his personality is not, there's not something like perseverance and resilience and learning orientation, then that person will probably not be able to perform above what the cognitive ability tests indicated. There's just one other thing to keep in mind. Most cognitive ability tests have an element of time, timing involved. And sometimes a person can do the task or can do the activity, but they're just slower in terms of doing it. And then it's just a question of that person must have more time to do it. And I'll give you a practical example. It is so that cognitive ability tests, people that take cognitive ability tests that are older usually score lower on the cognitive ability test. And that's just because of
reaction
with aging.
Thanks a lot, Sandra. You answering this question, you also answered another question about how do you combine psychometric tools and assessment center simulations. So probably everybody get the idea already. We've got one about follow-up questions about the analytical skills. How much time do you propose to set in individual development plan for employee for development analytical skills?
That's a very difficult question for me to answer, because you have to look at the person's context in which he is functioning and how much opportunity the person will get in his context to actually learn and apply that specific competency and skill. If I must take an average, I would say about 12 to 18 months. But like I've said, it totally depends on the context of the person. And I'm working from the assumption that the cognitive competencies that you've measured during the assessment center are critical requirements for the job that the person has to do. So the job environment would also enforce the competency as the person continues.
Sandra, I would ask one question, and probably we'll have to close our session because I know that our time is over already, but I can't miss this question about exercises because we talked about it many times, and there is a question how the assessment simulation should be developed to be valid and reliable.
Now, there's a very long answer to that.
Sandra, say key words, and then we invite the interested people to participate in your conferences year after the year.
Systematic process. Work hand in hand with your subject matter experts. Pre-pilot and pilot your simulations. Draw up a technical and an administration manual and collect data from your pre-pilot phase right through, because validity is a process, it's not an event.
Yeah, answers were done, but questions arise even more. But I believe that this is really a question for long discussion because there are different approaches here. Sandra, if you wish to say something to add to your about conference yourself or whatever, because we have to close our session.
So I'm going to refer to the theme of the conference, and the theme is from theory to practice into new beginnings. And that is the basis of all the presentations, that we follow an evidence-based approach. We incorporate the new developments, and we look at the future as to what's happening. And I invite everyone to attend our conference, and Svetlana, you will explain what we plan on doing in terms of the synchronous and asynchronous, but I'm very excited about next week's conference.
Sandra, thanks a lot for your interview. I believe it was very interesting for everybody. I hope it's not the last one, it's just the first one. And we can see you again and meet again somehow. Thank you very much. I hope you will get new participants at your conference.
So all I want to say is bye-bye, everyone.
Okay, bye, Sandra. Thanks a lot.
Pleasure. Bye-bye.